Bel's decision to side with the Xenos was probably one of the toughest he's ever had to make. I mean, it resulted in him having to sacrifice pretty much everything he's ever strived to accomplish. Although the anime does show some of the repercussions to his actions, they don't quite show us all of it. There's actually a lot of cutscenes that go towards showcasing how this incident has really impacted Orario. It does a much better job at establishing the consequences of Bel's actions, and that in turn highlights the inner struggle that Bel is currently dealing with. So let's pick things up right from when Bel was continuing his pursuit of Wiene. At this point, she wasn't rampaging because of Dix's curse anymore. I mean, he was dead before Asterius had even reached the surface. So Bel figured that her reason for running was actually because of Finn. His spear had reminded her of the trauma she'd experienced while being held captive. It was the fear those memories induced that kept Wiene on her rampage. As she continued to flee, she wasn't only attacked by arrows like how we saw in the anime. Her tail had been pierced by a javelin and her face had been hit numerous times by magic spells. To Wiene, they just looked like indiscriminate attacks from all directions, but to Bel it was very clear that they were using their attacks to guide her. No matter how much Bel pleaded with her to stop, Wiene just wouldn't listen. And even when he tried to redirect her by grabbing her tail, the other adventurers would just aim their attacks at him in order to prevent him from interfering. So where they ended up was a place that we were actually quite familiar with in Season 2. In case you weren't aware, this was the reconstruction zone for the Pleasure Quarter, the area where Ishtar's Familia once reigned supreme. It was a place that now acted as a pitfall that Wiene wouldn't be able to escape out of. Now, despite Bel following closely behind, none of the mages really cared for the potential friendly fire that they were about to inflict on him. Bel also didn't care that he was about to get hit by it. What mattered most was getting to Wiene. But unlike how they stopped attacking her in the anime, the mages had actually continued with even more spells of lightning, fire, and ice. It was a barrage of offensive magic that lasted until the ground broke. A flurry of spells that Bel ran straight into with absolutely no regard for his own personal safety. In the end, he ended up taking just as much damage as Wiene did, but no amount of flames, icy winds, or electric shocks would stop his body from moving. That said, the whole emotional scene after this was adapted rather faithfully. I mean, this was probably one of the best non-action scenes I've ever seen in DanMachi. Sure, it would have been more interesting to see Wiene stay dead for a couple of episodes, but just the way this scene was done from a cinematic standpoint was far beyond any of my expectations. So not very much really needs to be said about it. What I will say though is that Freya didn't mention anything about this being magic that transcends human knowledge. Instead, she said something along the lines of this being a light that she was familiar with. So that's a bit more of a peculiar statement than what was shown in the anime. In any case, what this was an ancient taboo magic that went against the very laws of the earth. A resurrection spell granted only to a unique sage like Vel's. Now, after everything was done, there was a cutscene that was supposed to show what the Loki Familia was going to do next. They had lost track of every monster that they were hunting, and all that remained at their last known location was a pile of monster ashes. So, to Finn, this was an absolute failure that he knew he'd have to resolve. Aiz, on the other hand, was more concerned about Bel's actions. Something about them seemed to incite her curiosity. The same could be said for pretty much every other person in Orario. The difference was that they had already concluded his actions to be completely foolish. This wasn't something that Aiz could fully agree with, but she also wouldn't call his actions heroic either. No, that was something that only Fels could do. You see, what Fels was trying to say at the end of the episode was that heroes who have to make the hardest decisions are often the most noble. Even if that decision is one that spurs anguish and doubt, that very hypocrisy is what allows him to be the hero. It's the trait that allowed him to make the right decision. He may not be proud of it and he may even doubt what he did, but in the end he should never regret it. That's what Fels wanted to make clear. He wanted Bel to understand that what stood in front of him right now were the very lives saved by his own foolish hypocrisy. These were words that were filled with so much conviction that it made Bel feel as if they were coming from his own grandfather. And they were definitely very much needed given that everyone else now held a certain feeling of hostility towards him. When Bel went back to the surface, almost every adventurer who saw him began to shout scornful remarks at him. But it's not like they weren't entirely justified. I mean, all around him there lay numerous injured people and rubble from destroyed buildings. So, to the people of Orario, this was simply because Bel decided not to let the Loki Familia take care of the problem. It was a single act of betrayal that had caused him to lose all the fame that he previously had. So that brings us now into episode 9, Stigma, covering chapters 1 and 2 from volume 11 of the light novels. While Hermes and Aninews were discussing what to do next, Hermes made the suggestion of bringing in the Loki Familia. They were, after all, the key thing blocking the Xenos from returning to the dungeon. The thing is, that just wasn't in the realm of possibility. And it's not like Hermes didn't know that before even asking. He already understood that Aninews couldn't reveal his involvement since he was the pillar supporting the city. So the question then becomes, why did Hermes even suggest it? Well, that was to lead into his other proposal. Hermes wanted Aninews to give him control, and to do that he was trying to make it seem like he was presenting a win-win situation. You see, if Hermes was put in charge of this operation, then Aninews would get to keep the Xenos a secret and Hermes would be able to salvage Bel's image. That was what Hermes was trying to offer. At first it was rather odd for Hermes to be wanting to do so much for Bel, but Aninews immediately understood why the moment Hermes mentioned who Bel was. Bel's relationship to Zeus was all Aninews needed to hear in order to accept Hermes' offer. Now, the next scene with Mord was actually a little bit different. Him and a few other adventurers were patrolling the sewers in search of the Xenos. You see, it had been a full 3 days since they first appeared on the surface. And since then, the city had been placed under lockdown and the guild had posted bounties on almost every individual Xenos. So many adventurers were now wandering underneath the streets of Daedalus in search of their targets. It was as they were that Mord had come across another group talking shit about Bel. Mord, being the tsundere he is, stepped in order to get them to stop. He tried to justify Bel's actions by saying it was because of Hestia's debt, but that was nothing more than a random excuse he just came up with on the spot. While the group continued to argue, they also wandered deeper into the sewers, and that's when they happened to stumble across Lido. He was on patrol to make sure that no one was nearby. Fortunately, he was able to scare off all of them by beating up a few of them, but this meant that the Xenos now had to move from where they were. When Lido rejoined the group, he found that the noise of the battle had finally woken up Wiene from her resurrection. So Ray was telling her everything that had happened, especially the parts about them being saved by Asterius. Just from the way that she was talking about him, Wiene could tell that Asterius was very important to her. He was very important to all the Xenos, so that went to explain why they were carrying around his severed arm. That said, there was a little flashback after this that gave context as to how Asterius came to be. But since this could still be included in a later episode, I won't say too much other than the fact that he was taken in and taught how to understand his desires by the Xenos. As for what that desire was, well, I'm sure you can guess it was the insatiable hunger for battle. A hunger that couldn't simply be satisfied by killing monsters on the deeper floors of the dungeon. But anyway, let's move on to the beginning parts of the episode now. This whole sequence in the Hestia mansion was modified quite a bit. You see, Hermes never actually came to their house to talk. And since Bel was under what was pretty much house arrest, he was very anxious by not being able to help the Xenos. Even if going out in public did result in him being bombarded with insults and hostility, for him the scariest thing of all was simply doing nothing. So Hestia eventually agreed to let him go out under the condition that she joins him. On their way to Daedalus, Bel overheard numerous different criticisms that speculated into any and every reason for his actions. As much as he resolved himself to accept them, it still hurt every time he heard them. Now, Bel had actually stopped at the benevolent mistress while on his way. He wanted to thank Liu for saving him back on the 18th floor. But the moment they came face to face, Bel couldn't say a single word. The stigma that came with being the most hated person in Orario made him unable to. So, Liu spoke first. She immediately eased any tension by saying she wasn't going to deprecate him just because of some rumors. Liu still believed that Bel had his own justifiable reasons for acting the way that he did. And even though she wanted to know what they were, she knew that it was something that Bel would share when he was ready. The same could also be said for how Liu obtained the key. Although Bel was curious as to how she got one, he wasn't going to pry into something that she didn't want to share. So both were hiding their own little secrets. In any case, the main point was that Liu didn't want Bel to regret any of his decisions. And considering her past, she was probably one of the few people who could actually empathize with him. So it's for that reason that Bel truly appreciated what she was saying. Now, when Bel and Hestia finally got to Daedalus, there was something odd about the way the adventurers were acting with each other. They didn't seem to be too cooperative. This was strange because Bell was sure that with so many people working towards one goal, they should have been able to find the Xenos by now, especially with the bounties spurring everyone to take action. But it was actually because there were bounties that the likeliness of that happening wasn't very high. You see, Aninews had two very good reasons behind putting such a massive bounty on the Xenos. The first was to maintain his image and make it seem like the guild was serious. The second was to diminish the level of cooperation. The idea was that if the reward was big enough, then groups of adventurers would choose to work alone and stop sharing information, thus slowing down any progress they would normally make as a collective. Now, after Bell had come across Loki, that's when we get to a very different scene involving Sida, mainly because it had to do with the orphanage that we never got to see from Season 2. But basically what had happened was that Bell had spotted the kids from the orphanage. When he went to go see them, all three stepped back as if they were afraid of him. It was as if they didn't want to be anywhere near him. What stung the most though was when Lai had called him a traitor. Both him and the others now saw Bell as the sole reason why their neighborhood was now this wreck. So, however highly they had thought of him in the past, they clearly didn't think that way anymore. This was the very moment that served as Bell's tipping point. Seeing how much his actions had hurt these children, now pushed his guilt to a point far higher than it ever was before. He just stood there completely dejected as the children left him behind to go into the orphanage. As they slammed the door in his face, Bell collapsed to his knees with a mind that couldn't make sense of anything. He was lost in his own thoughts of doubt and regret as he was no longer sure that he made the right decision. But it was only a moment later that that same door reopened and out came Sida. As it turns out, this was one of the days that she was spending at the orphanage. She was checking to see if Maria and the orphans would need to evacuate. After what happened 3 days ago, Sida could tell that the atmosphere around Daedalus was different. She understood that this place could turn into a battleground at any moment, so she was there to make sure that everyone was safe. In any case, Sida continued to talk while Bell said absolutely nothing. He couldn't. He was still in shock over how the kids had treated him. So Sida just continued to talk and smile as if everything was normal, leading to the conversation plus lap pillow that we saw in the anime. It's after this that we switch over to a lengthy conversation between Finn and Royman. Royman was scolding Finn for having broken the guild's standby orders. So, as punishment, he was trying to get the Loki Familia to move out of Daedalus. Of course, Finn wasn't going to back down just because the guildmaster told him to. Instead, he started to negotiate a deal. In exchange for being able to continue their investigation, Finn said that he would give the guild a key to Gnosis, something the guild didn't even know the Loki Familia was aware of. As it turns out, Ikelos had given them quite a bit of information before he was exiled. So, since they had already come to know about this secret, it really only made sense to let them be the ones to continue the investigation. The only thing was that they had to report on every single detail they came across. Now, it's not like both parties absolutely trusted the other. It's just that they were at a point where cooperation was necessary. It was very clear though that they both had their own specific interests. That said, neither of them had a very firm grasp on the entire picture. There was a missing piece to this puzzle that Finn knew he could only get from Bell. That didn't mean that he regarded Bell as an enemy though. What the anime didn't quite show was that Finn was actually very close to figuring out why Bell acted the way that he did. He knew that there was something special about these monsters, and he knew that Bell had become aware of what that something was. So that led Finn to believe that whatever that something was, it was enough to steer Bell to the point that he had to oppose them. This was basically Finn saying that he still had faith in Bell. He still believed in him both as a person and as an adventurer. So, because Finn wanted to know what he was missing, he had actually gone to confront Bell on the streets of Daedalus. When they finally met, he pretty much told Bell that he knew that he was hiding something. If he told him right here and now what that was, then Finn said that he was willing to overlook the incident with the monsters. This wasn't meant to be an intimidating statement. All Finn wanted to know was the truth. He truly believed that all these problems could have been avoided had Bell shared what he knew with them. As far as he was concerned, everything from the other day was just a simple misunderstanding. Bell definitely agreed that there could have been a different outcome had he told the Loki Familia. But back then his instincts had told him not to trust them. This, however, was now a completely different situation. You see, Bell was starting to feel that since Wiene was no longer a threat, perhaps he could actually work together with the Loki Familia. I mean, right now Finn was appearing to be rather understanding. His intentions may not have been entirely clear, but it did look like he was willing to cooperate. So it was as Belle was about to speak that Hermes came in to interrupt the conversation, preventing Belle from saying any more than he should have and sending Finn on his way. This was much more than just convenient timing. You see, Hermes didn't believe that the Loki Familia would actually help his cause. He felt that they were just going to use Belle to get to the Xenos. It didn't matter if they knew the Xenos were intelligent or not, because in the end the Loki Familia would always choose to exterminate them. That's what Hermes wanted Belle to believe. It was after this that Hermes went on to tell Belle all about his Familia's involvement. He was basically telling Belle that he could trust them. It was actually quite the huge relief since Belle had considered himself backed into a corner. As they continued to talk, Hestia finally caught back up to where Belle was, prompting Hermes to take his leave right after. Something about Hermes seemed a little bit weird though. Hestia found it a bit suspicious that he didn't want to have a proper discussion with her. It was as if her presence had made him apprehensive to the topic. Now, there was a cut scene after this involving Ganesha and Shakti. Because the subjugation team had taken such a heavy hit, Ganesha was checking up to see how his captain was doing. He also wanted to know what she thought when she was fighting the Xenos. You see, Shakti was one of the few Familia members who actually knew what the Xenos were. So Ganesha was curious as to what her opinion was. As she recounted what happened, she said that she was frightened by their existence but at the same time also felt sympathy. The thing is, that sympathy had led to hesitation, and that hesitation had almost cost them their lives. It was because of this that Ganesha felt he could no longer take the side of the Xenos. He couldn't stand to see his Familia or any other people get hurt by them. So if they were to return to the surface and start fighting with humans, then Ganesha vowed that he would take the side of the people. That was one reaction out of many from the deities who weren't sure what to do with this situation. When Hephaestus was considering it herself, in the case that the Xenos became public knowledge, she believed that 20% of the gods would call for their expulsion, 10% would strive towards coexistence, then the other 70% would try to stir up trouble. Of course, for their own personal entertainment. So, regardless of how she looked at it, the Xenos just didn't seem to fit in. It was a problem she simply didn't want to get involved with. Now, the rest of the preparations with Hermes, Fels, and Finn were pretty much as we saw. The only factor that was excluded from the anime was Freya. I mean, she was the reason why the Xenos couldn't break their way through Babel. If they were to try to get into the dungeon through the main entrance, then it was very likely that Freya's Familia would get involved. And that was by far a much greater threat than the Loki Familia. As it was now though, no one was sure whether she'd choose to get involved or not. But if she did, everyone knew that no faction would be safe. So that was something that they all needed to account for. But anyway, that was pretty much everything you missed from episode 9. There was definitely a lot more cut content here than there was for any of the other episodes. I guess they needed to pick things up a bit so they could adapt the rest of Volume 11. Hopefully the next 3 episodes aren't too rushed though. In any case, you can be sure that I'll cover it in my next 2 cut contents. So hopefully I can finish those by the end of next week. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!